Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm an MVP for Office Servers and Services. And in this module, we're going to look at getting started with the SharePoint Framework. And in the first section, we're going to focus on just introducing the SharePoint Framework. So in this section, we're going to cover what is the SharePoint Framework and where is it supported. And then we'll talk about configuring your Office 365 developer tenant for SharePoint Framework development. The SharePoint user experience has been evolving across multiple versions throughout the years. And this slide is just showing us the history, starting all the way back with SharePoint Portal Server 2001 and moving all the way up to present day, which is SharePoint Server 2016, SharePoint Online, and SharePoint 2019. We've had different development models throughout the years, and the current model that we're focused on using is something called the SharePoint Framework, or SPFX, and also leveraging something called the Office Fabric, or the Office UI Fabric. And the idea here is to focus primarily on building applications that are client-side and hosted inside of SharePoint. And for those things that are not hosted inside of SharePoint and can't be client-side, we can use things like remote experiences such as those hosted within Azure or other external services. Some of the different extensibility principles focused around the SharePoint framework and building long-term value-added services for enterprise mobility include the following. We want to be able to provide an application development framework that aligns to both first parties and third parties. Now, what this means is that first party is considered Microsoft. They want to be able to build a framework that they can use to extend SharePoint themselves without having to have their own special development model. But then they also want to be able to give us this model and let us use this in our own custom solutions. And that involves the third party being customers of SharePoint and not Microsoft themselves, but customers and developers building their own components. The second principle is to be able to build on industry-leading client-side solutions on premises and in the cloud. So what they want to be able to do is be able to build applications, client-side based applications primarily, that then can be leveraged both in Office 365 and SharePoint Online, but then we also want to use them on-prem as well. And the SharePoint framework is available both on SharePoint Server 2016 and SharePoint Server 2019, and of course, always in SharePoint Online, which is in the Office 365 in the cloud. The third principle is unlocking the potentials of SharePoint in the Microsoft Graph on desktops or any device. It's a mobile-first experience, and it's one that also has APIs to allow us to very easily interact with SharePoint and custom data that lives inside or exposed via the Microsoft Graph that lives inside of Office 365, but then very easily also be able to call other services that may be secured with Azure AD or data that lives outside of the Microsoft domain. So the SharePoint framework is modern client-side development. The idea is that all of your customizations that you create and build will all be deployed and run in the browser. They won't have a server-side component. You can always create your own server-side component, but you're going to host that yourself in some other location. It's also lightweight and for both web and mobile. Because it's client-side solutions and because we're relying just on JavaScript and HTML and CSS and images, it's going to run the exact same way in the browser as it does in the mobile experiences as well. We want to be able to power our own experiences. We want to be able to take SharePoint and extend it to create our own custom web parts. It's also backwards compatible, meaning that it's going to work on classic pages, not just the modern pages, but also on classic pages as well. And then finally, we want to support open source tools and common JavaScript web frameworks like React, like Knockout, like jQuery and Angular. Now, before we dive too far into this, we need to look at something called a modern page. What is a modern page? The difference between a modern page and what we formerly knew, which is now we're calling those classic pages, is that a modern page is client-side rendered. It's not rendered on the server side, which is how we used to do like server-side based web parts. It's natively responsive, meaning that if I resize the browser, it's going to resize and re-render out the page that makes the most sense for the current experience. Web parts that you create will all be running and re-rendered client-side as well. They won't be running server-side. We'll also be able to leverage persistent caches, so data that's being cached by the SharePoint Framework API or in other different APIs that they provide to us, such as like local storage and other things that we can do in the browser. And things are also mobile optimized, meaning that these pages will render both in the client if you're using a browser or on like a desktop or a laptop, as well as if you're on a phone or a tablet or other mobile experiences. Now, modern site pages must be easily creatable to create beautiful looking pages. They're going to help you communicate ideas and information using new authoring canvases and a gallery of web parts. Some of the different building blocks that are available to us are things like we're going to have this canvas and web parts. And these are all built using client-side HTML and JavaScript. Pages are reusable in custom applications as well. Mobile support is built in from the start, which means that current reflows across device sizes and pages are fast and fluid. And pages can get better with the Microsoft Graph because developers can leverage the Microsoft Graph to surface relevant pages to the people that need to read them. Now, is all SharePoint Online development done in JavaScript? And the answer is no. In many similar ways as SharePoint add-in model, server-side development is needed for some back-end services. The SharePoint framework is simply concentrating on the user interface side, not on the fundamentals around the API usage. So you can still create server-side solutions, but they're not going to be visible or surfaced inside of SharePoint in SharePoint Online. Instead, you can create a SharePoint framework component that's going to interact with those back-end APIs. Now, what's involved in actually getting your environment up and running? Well, there's a couple different things you need to take into consideration. Office 365 developer tenant setup steps are pretty simple and straightforward. You're first going to set up an Office 365 tenant. You're going to need that to do your development. Now, this is something that can be any tenant that you use for your existing company Office 365, but you can also sign up to the Office developer program and get access to a developer tenant, which is the exact same thing as you would normally get. It's just if you were signing up to Office 365, this just gives you a little bit of an easier way to kind of work with stuff. And it's free as well. You can also you're also going to need to create an app catalog site. And this is where you're going to deploy your components. You can think of it almost as like the SharePoint store in a sense, where you're going to install your components, such as a web part, into your sites from this app catalog site. You're then going to want to create a new site collection for testing. And this can be a developer site or it can be a normal site, but you want to make sure that this is a modern site so that you can do your testing against a modern experience. You also have access to something called the online Workbench. This is for where you can test your components when they're going to be running up in Office 365, where you want to work with real live data. So you can sign up for an Office 365 developer tenant by signing up to the Office Developer Program, and you're going to receive a welcome email with a link to sign up for your Office 365 developer tenant. Then you're going to create the app catalog site. So this is going to be navigating to your SharePoint Admin Center, and then you're going to select the apps menu, and then from there select app catalog, and it's going to either detect that you already have an app catalog or it's going to prompt you to create a new app catalog. You're then going to want to create a new developer site collection. And so technically the developer site collection is targeted for add-in development, but you're going to need to have it for a location to test your web parts for the SharePoint framework and using the online Workbench. It can really be any site, but the developer site just makes a lot of sense. Here's the hosted Workbench. Now what this is that this is a special page that is going to be a blank page that you can add web parts to test them out. And this is not only going to show us the web parts that have been deployed to our SharePoint tenant in the app catalog, but it's also going to show us all of the web parts that we may be running off of our local developer environment on our laptop or on our desktop that we have in our office. This is something that's going to make it easy for us to do testing for our components without having to go through a full deployment process. So in this first demo, we're going to look at how to configure our Office 365 environment for SharePoint development. The first step is to create and configure your SharePoint Online developer tenant. So I'm going to do that by first launching the browser and going to portal.office.com. I'm going to start by logging in to my Office 365 tenant. Now if I come over here to admin, and if I scroll down to the SharePoint Admin Center, I'll find a list of all the site collections that I have that have been set up here. And so in this case, I can tell that I don't have an app catalog that's already been created for me. So I'm going to come over here and click on Apps. I'm then going to click on App Catalog. And you can see here that I do actually have an app catalog that has been created ahead of time for me. If I had not had one created, it would have taken me to a page to where I can then create an app catalog. And everything is pretty self-explanatory from there on how it actually created. Now the next thing I want to do is create a site where I can test all of my custom development. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select a private site collection. And I'm just going to call this my developer site. Now, as I run through this, so I'm going to come over here to this site right here, I'll scroll down a little bit, and I'll call it my dev site. And I will put it in the sites called dev site like this. And then I will go to the collaboration and choose developer site, and then set the additional information here like the administrator. And then I'll click on this little check names piece to validate the name. And once that's done, I'm going to click OK. SharePoint is now going to go ahead and create my new site collection. This is going to take some time here, so I'm going to let this go ahead and finish. And we're not going to wait around for this. I'm just going to go ahead and let this finish. In this next section, we're going to look at how to configure your SharePoint developer environment and understanding and installing the necessary tools. We're going to look at a comparison between what traditional SharePoint server-side development looked like and what the difference is with this client-side developer model. We're going to look at Node.js, NPM, Yeoman, Gulp, and TypeScript. SharePoint Framework leverages an open source Node.js based toolchain and embraces all the web frameworks and code editors. You've got a couple different sections of things that we need to look at. You've got a build process and tooling. You've got things like Yeoman templates. And what Yeoman is that's going to replace the file new project experience that we have in Visual Studio. Gulp is a task runner. It effectively is going to replace the MS build. Node.js is the runtime. All of these tools that I'm mentioning here, they're all built on top of Node.js. So just like you would normally install the .NET framework, we're going to install Node.js so we can run all these tools. These are tools that are not built and provided by Microsoft, rather they're done by the greater web community. And they're all open source tools. So the open source community has chosen to use Node.js so that all of these things would be cross-platform and work on all different platforms, not just Windows or just on Mac OS or on Linux. We have other things too, like NPM, System.js, Webpack, Sass, and TypeScript. We can then choose to use which web framework we want to leverage inside of our custom configurations or custom components. We could use React or Angular or Knockout, jQuery. It really doesn't matter. It's totally up to you, as the SharePoint framework does not limit you from any choices. And then finally, you're going to need a code editor to do all of your work. Most people are using Visual Studio Code by Microsoft. It's a very lightweight version of Visual Studio, and it really is just a text editor with some nice and handy extensions. You could choose another one if you wanted to, something as simple as Notepad or Atom or Sublime or WebStorm. It really doesn't matter. But in this course, you're going to see us use Visual Studio Code. It's free, it's small, it's fast and lightweight. It's a great option. Now, what I find is that most people get a little confused when they see the differences with all these new tools and this new development model. And they kind of get a little intimidated sometimes as well because it's foreign, they don't know what these things are. So what I want to do is I want to compare the server-side developer tools to the client-side dev tools that we're going to be using in SharePoint Framework development. So for example here, across the top, we have IIS Express, .NET, NuGet, MS Build, C#, and Visual Studio project templates. This is all what you've been used to using if you've done any ASP.NET development or server-side based Webpart development with previous versions of SharePoint. The first thing we're going to look at is Node.js. All Node.js is just a JavaScript runtime for running JavaScript on the server. It is a wrapper to the V8 engine out of the Chrome browser, and with some extra APIs that allow the V8 engine to run outside of the browser and instead run on a desktop. You don't have to be a Node developer for this to do SharePoint Framework development. Instead, all you're going to be doing is you're just going to be installing Node so that all the other tools to the right are going to work. You then are going to want to install npm, and this is a package manager. Just like NuGet fetches packages from the NuGet registry, npm is one of many package managers that is going to fetch packages from the npm.js registry. MS-build is we are replacing that, which is just a task runner, with something called gulp. Gulp takes tasks that are defined in JavaScript and it will run them for us. We're going to use this to do things like building our project and transpiling the SAS files to CSS or TypeScript to JavaScript, and then bundling it up and doing all the packaging. Speaking of TypeScript, that's the language that we're going to be working with. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript with a lot of extra stuff in it to make JavaScript development a little bit easier. If you are not familiar with JavaScript or you're not familiar with TypeScript, think of it as like a C-sharpish kind of flavor to JavaScript. It's maybe a bad example, but really all it is it's just giving us, if you think about it from a very simplistic way, TypeScript gives you a lot of stuff, but the big one that it gives you is type checking and the ability to use classes and future features coming to JavaScript inside of TypeScript today. When you compile your project, you're not going to be deploying TypeScript, you're going to be deploying JavaScript in your components. The same way when you build a web part, you don't deploy C# code, you deploy compiled code. And then finally on the far end, we got this thing called Yeoman and Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is our code editor. What Yeoman is a task or a project scaffolding tool that what happens is that you're going to install Yeoman and then a Yeoman generator. And then when you run the Yeoman generator, it's going to ask you a bunch of questions, just like if you were in Visual Studio and you did File New Project and you pick the template, it's going to ask you a bunch of questions. Once you've answered those questions, Yeoman, just like Visual Studio, is going to go provision out and create your folders and files and template out your code so that you can get started working with your project. So just to go in a little more depth here, Nodejs, this is a cross-platform JavaScript runtime, and it pretty much serves the same role as the .NET Framework does for C#-based projects. All of the SharePoint Framework's open source tooling is built on top of Node.js, and at the present time recording, the SharePoint Framework supports Node.js long-term support version V8. Now, if you want to go through and you want to use a different version of Node.js, you can, but make sure you check with the SharePoint Framework documentation and find out what version they're recommending, as if you try to go with a more recent version that is not in the LTS branch, is more in the current or the stable branch, you may not have the desired experience there. So just double check on what you're going to use before you start installing another version of Node. Then you have a package manager, and this is the npm tool. What this is going to fetch packages from the npm.js registry, and it effectively replaces what we used to use NuGet for in a .NET server-side based project. This is included when you install Node.js. Yeoman is a project scaffolding generator, and its job is to run the other generators that will be installed. And in our case, we're going to have a generator for the SharePoint Framework. So what you're going to do is you're going to say yo space and then the name of the generator. And what Yeoman does is it will spin up the generator, which will then ask you a series of questions. And then the generator tells Yeoman what folders are supposed to be created, what files are supposed to be created, what things are supposed to be changed in the files, etc. This is something that you're going to have to install, as well as the SharePoint Framework generator, as you see there on the slide. Gulp is a task runner, and this is the thing that's going to replace what we call MS-build that we use for the .NET Framework. We define tasks using JavaScript, and this is going to allow us to have like repeatable processes that are just going to be given a name and say, go run this name. So for example, doing things like saying compile or package, or starting a testing process. The nice thing is with this is that Microsoft has created all the required tasks for SharePoint Framework. You can create your own, but all the ones you're going to need out of the box are already there, making your life nice and easy. TypeScript is effectively type JavaScript. It is a superset of the JavaScript language, and it's going to compile down to plain old JavaScript. The development language for the base templates in the SharePoint Framework projects is TypeScript. Now, you can also integrate native JavaScript in the SharePoint Framework customizations if you wanted to. You can also integrate native JavaScript into SharePoint Framework customizations without the need to really rewrite everything. There's a little bit more work that you're going to have to do, though. It depends on what you're actually trying to integrate in to a project. So this isn't as just simple as copy paste. It really depends on what you were doing to see what other work you may end up having to do here. The version of TypeScript that's supported by the SharePoint Framework is included in each SharePoint Framework project. In this demo, we're going to look at how to configure your developer environment and installing all the necessary tools that you need to do proper SharePoint Framework development. Let's go set up our local SharePoint developer environment. Now, the first thing I need to do is install a code editor, and I can do that by grabbing the Visual Studio Code Editor by going to code.visualstudio.com. And here I can go ahead and download the editor and install it. I already have one installed, an instance of it installed that you can see here, so I don't need to go about doing that in this step. The next thing I need to do is I need to install Node. And I can check to see if Node is already installed by opening up a command prompt and typing node space v or -v. And here I can see that I already have a version of Node already installed. And I'm in pretty good shape because it's using an LTS version. But if I did not have anything come back here, what I could do is go to the nodejs.org website. And here I can grab the latest LTS version of Node. Don't get the current version, always get the LTS version. So download that and then install it, and it's all pretty self-explanatory how to go about installing that. So once that's done, you can see here I have Node installed. I can check to see what packages are installed so far. So I can say npm list -g and then --depth equals 0. So what this is doing is telling npm, which is the package manager and package management utility. It's saying list out all of the packages that are globally installed, so with the -g, and that are at a depth of 0. And that basically says ignore all the ones that are installed as dependencies from something else that's been installed. Only show me the ones that I've installed. So in this case here, npm is the only one that's listed because it came with the Node install. Now, I need to install a couple different things. I'm first going to need to install Yeoman. So I'm going to say npm install I could say -- global, or I could just say -g, and then I'll say space yo. That's going to download the Yeoman scaffolding engine. And I'll just let this finish. All right, so now that Yeoman is installed, I now need to install the generator that Yeoman is going to use to work with the SharePoint framework. And so I'm going to do that by saying npm install global at Microsoft/generator-SharePoint. With that installed, the last thing I'm going to need to install here is say npm install -- global gulp. And that's going to install my task runner. So now we have everything set up and we're in pretty good shape. So I'll then go back and say npm list everything out that we've installed. Make sure that we see everything that we need, which is Yeoman, the SharePoint Framework generator. Yep, so here we go. Yeoman, the SharePoint Framework generator, and gulp. And we know that it's all installed and we're in good shape. So now we're ready to do SharePoint Framework development. Now that we have set up our developer environment, let's look at interacting with SharePoint Framework web parts on modern pages. We're going to talk about adding client-side web parts to modern pages, introducing the new reactive property pane, and validating local SharePoint Framework developer environments. SharePoint is really built upon web parts. It's a really core functionality that we have to extending the web part or the SharePoint experience using reusable components. They're configurable, reusable, and purpose-built components, and it's a framework. We also have a framework for connecting related components. Web parts have a context, can be contextually aware of their environment, if we're in read mode or publish mode or what else is on the page, and it allows us to add functionality to SharePoint pages. Now, what's different here from previous versions of SharePoint development models is that we're working with client-side web parts, not server-side web parts. But they're still just web parts. They're still just little squares that have been carved out on a page where we can have our own functionality. They're built for the modern JavaScript-driven web, and they run directly inside of a SharePoint page. So they have the same context as the current user that's interacting with the SharePoint page. Adding a SharePoint Framework web part to a page is very simple. You're going to put a web part or a page inside of edit mode, and then you're going to add a web part via the toolbox. So here you can see on the slide, I'm going to click that little red plus in the middle of that line going across horizontally across the screen. And when I do that, I'm going to get this dialog where I can choose the web part I wanted to add to the page. From there, I can then edit the web part in a couple different ways. Some web parts, like the text web part, is going to allow me to edit the text right in line on the page. And other ones may be using the property pane on the right-hand side that you would be used to when working with server-side based web parts. So in this demo, let's look at interacting with SharePoint Framework client-side web parts in modern sites. Now what I want to do here is I want to add and interact with SharePoint Framework-based client-side web parts in a SharePoint Online Modern Site collection. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to navigate to my developer site that we created in a previous demo. So you can see I've already gone ahead and done that here at dev site. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new modern page that we can use to test with. So I'm going to come over here to the pages library. I'm then going to select new and then select the site page. So here we have a page that's been created, and I'm going to go ahead and just close out of this new experience here. And one of the other things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and kind of hide or shrink up this top part of the page here to make it a little bit easier to work with. And I'm just going to call this my playground. All right. So now the first thing that we'll do here is let's go ahead and add a new web part. So I'll do that by clicking on this plus and choosing text. And here I have a nice inline experience. So I could say something like, hello, SharePoint Framework. And I could select all of this text and make it bold or make it very big with this heading frame here. Then I can save all my changes by just clicking publish. The page will be saved. And here we go. We actually have our custom page that we've created here. Now, before we part here, let's talk a little bit about validating your local SharePoint Framework development configuration. You're first going to need to install the required runtimes and tools, and that's installing Nodejs, npm. That's included with Nodejs. You're then going to need to install Yeoman, the SharePoint Framework generator for Yeoman as well, and gulp. So what you're going to do is you can say, once you've done that, you're then going to be able to create your first project by saying yo@Microsoft/SharePoint, answer a bunch of questions, and then once that's done, you should just be able to say gulp serve, and you'll have a web part that's up and running on your local environment. So let's see how to do this in this next demo. Now the next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to use the tools that we set up in the previous demo to go about creating a brand new project and see what it looks like. So I'm going to come over here and let's do a clear out here. And I'm going to jump over here into my dev folder. And we'll make a new folder here called my first web part. And I'm going to run the generator by saying yo@Microsoft/SharePoint. And what this is going to do is it's going to start up the Yeoman generator. So first time I'm running it, so I'm going to get a little experience here. I'll just say yes. Now it's going to say, what do you want to call it? So I'm going to call mine hello world. It's going to say, what baseline packages do you want to target your component for? I'm going to say SharePoint Online. If I chose one of the other options, it would limit the things that I could create that are only available in SharePoint Online. It doesn't really make a difference in this part of the demo, so I'm just going to leave it as is. We moved into our existing folder where we want to create the project, so I'll just leave it as use the current folder. It's then going to ask us if we want to allow tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites immediately without running the feature deployment. I'm going to choose no as being the default option there. We'll talk about that in other modules. Then it's going to ask me, do you want to allow, which type of client-side component do you want to create? And I say I want to create a web part. My web part's going to be named Hello World, and I'll just leave as the default description, and I'm not going to use any special web framework. I'm just going to use just standard JavaScript. And so what's happening now is that after all the files have been provisioned, and let's go ahead and let's open this up so you can see what this looks like. And here what you can see is that it's created all of those files that we need for our project. In the background, what it's doing is it's running npm install, and it's downloading all the packages that are defined here in package.json that our project needs in order to run. It's downloading all of those files in the background for us that it needs. So these packages plus all the packages that it needs. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to do once this is finished here, come over here back to the command prompt, and we're going to have to wait for this to finish. So I'm just going to use the magic of video editing and let this continue so you don't have to wait around for it. Okay, so now that our project has been provisioned, the next step we have to do before we can run this is I need to do, if I run this gulp tasks, what you'll see here is I have a task that's available to me called Trust Dev Cert. And I'm going to need to do this before I run my very first project. Otherwise, I'm going to get an error when this thing runs. So what gulp task is doing is it's looking at all the tasks that have been installed by the SharePoint Framework's generator. So we can see here we have one called Trust Dev Cert. So I'm going to say gulp Trust Dev Cert. There we go. So we're good. So now, without doing anything special with our web part, I'm just going to go ahead and try running it. So I'll say gulp serve. And what this is going to do is create or compile and build up the project so that I can then use it in a SharePoint environment. We're not going to do anything special with this web part right now. I just want to show you that it's working. So here we go. We created one called Hello World. So if I click on this plus, I should see Hello World. And sure enough, I do. And I should be able to edit it and say, Hello SharePoint Framework. And so this is proving that everything we've installed and set up is working in our SharePoint local developer experience for working with the SharePoint framework. So in future modules, we'll see how to do a whole bunch more stuff. In this module, we looked at adding client-side web parts to modern pages and introduced the new web part model, client-side web part development, and then how to also validate our local SharePoint developer environment. That concludes this module. I hope you got a lot out of this Getting Started module, and in future modules, we'll dive into the depths of a lot more stuff that we can do with the SharePoint framework. Thanks for watching.